And welcome to 5 Live Boxing between now and 9 o'clock. With me, as always, 5 Live's boxing correspondent Mike Costello and boxing writer and broadcaster Steve Bunce. Good evening to both of you.
Good evening, Ellie.
Between now and 9, you'll hear from Carl Frampton, from Barry McGuigan and from Anthony Joshua. And Mike, you're in Belfast for what should be another great night of boxing on Saturday night on 5 Live.
Yes, and I thought the press conference today, first of all, was fascinating. If you didn't know your boxing and you walked in there and were told that two of these men were fighting on Saturday amongst the hordes of people, you'd have comfortably picked out Martinez. He was looking nervous and withdrawn behind dark glasses, but you'd never have identified Frampton, who was looking disarmingly relaxed, I thought. And he said there at the start of the show that he'd begun boxing at the age of 7. He's been building 20 years to this date, but you'd never have known it. And the press conference was taking place in a building called Titanic Belfast, which is a museum-type attraction that houses the story of the ship that was built and launched here in 1911, a year before the fateful voyage towards New York a year later. And it's right next to the slipways leading into the water that the temporary arena here has been constructed. 16,000 capacity for Saturday night. And there is a genuine buzz here in Belfast that something special has taken root.
Well, Steve, you haven't been quite on a 20-year journey with Carl Frampton, but you've seen a lot of the last few years with him. Yeah. He's a genuine star.
He is a genuine star. We're on a 5-year journey, and we've moved from leisure centres in the middle of Belfast to the King's Hall, to the Ulster Hall. We've moved up to the Odyssey at Great Arena. Now we're moving outdoors. I've watched this kid go from attracting a couple of hundred hardcore fans to what is going to attract 16,000 on Saturday. And what's interesting, he's attracted people over the last few years who aren't boxing fans, and that shocks people. People go for the Frampton effect. He is, according to the Northern Irish government, a tourist attraction before he's a sporting attraction. How about that?
Well, you'll hear from both Carl Frampton and from Barry McGuigan very shortly. On 5 Live Sport this Saturday night, we've commentary on Carl Frampton's first ever world title fight in Belfast. He's up against the IBF Super Bantamweight champion Kiko Martinez. And Mike, as we hinted at the start of the programme, in a sport which is full of great stories, Frampton's journey is a fascinating one.
Yes, it is, and he has that momentum that we've just been referring to, and he and the team around him are capitalising on that. He has a strong amateur pedigree, but he's really excelled since turning professional. He's unbeaten in 18 fights. He has a win earlier over Kiko Martinez 18 months ago when the European title was at stake. Martinez has since gone on to win the world title, so it adds a fascinating element to La Revancha, as they're saying in Spain, the revenge match. But it's more than Frampton's ability that is his appeal here. It's the backstory that really appeals. He's a Protestant married to a Catholic. He's from an area here in Belfast close to the venue for the fight on Saturday night. It's a place called Tigers Bay, and it's known as an interface where sectarian troubles between rival communities living close together have often flared in the past. And not for the first time, boxing has helped to build a bridge over the divide. And it was interesting, fascinating at the press conference today to see Frampton sat next to his manager and mentor Barry McGuigan, because there, side by side, was the link between the past and the present. Because you have to go back 30 years to the heyday of Barry McGuigan to feel the same kind of excitement being generated around boxing here. Indeed, McGuigan saying that nobody across the UK has captivated boxing like Frampton since McGuigan's own days back in the mid-1980s. And that can only grow if Frampton wins on Saturday night.
Well, BBC Sport's Ben Durs went to interview Carl Frampton in Belfast. Frampton recalled losing a friend in the conflict, and at quite an early age.
Glenn Branagh is his name. I knew his brother. I was very friendly with his brother Sam. Glenn was a year older than me, but I knew him quite well, and obviously an incident at the bottom of the street, and he lost his life in the middle of a riot. And young guy, very, very young, and I kind of seen the aftermath of it, and it wasn't nice, you know. I can't remember how old he was when he died, but very, very young. Obviously, when something like that happens when you're a kid, it has a major effect on you, and you don't want to see anything like that again. But I was already sort of trying to stay away from any sort of sectarian trouble, anything like that at all.
I understand that your granddad saw Barry McGuigan fight at the Loyalist Club on Shankill Road.
Yeah.
So you were aware at a pretty early age of boxing's ability to bring communities together.
Yeah, you're hearing stories, you know, pretty much as soon as you get involved in boxing. And I was back and forward to Holy Family, which is the nationalist housing estate opposite Tigers Bay, and that was unheard of unless you were boxing. You know, you weren't mixing with them guys unless you were boxing. So there were stories like that. You know, Barry boxed for an Ireland team in the Loyalist Club on the Shankill, wearing shamrocks and green vests, you know, and this is at the height of the Troubles, and the Shankill butchers and stuff were around. So, but when it's boxing, no one says a dicky bird, and people get let to do what they want to do, and that's just how it is, you know. And it's the way it should be in every sport, and I think other sports can maybe take a leaf out of our book.
How big a hero was Barry McGuigan, a Catholic, in this area here?
Barry was massive to everyone, and you know, that old saying, leave the fighting to McGuigan, and it doesn't sound like much, but when he was fighting, you know, the trouble in the street stopped for a couple of hours, and a couple of hours doesn't sound like much, but when it's constant, then that's a big deal. But he was a hero for both communities. You know, he wore the dove and on his shorts. He didn't get involved with any flags or anything like that. So that's why people liked him. That's why they came out and supported him. And that's why he had such a huge fan base, not just here but worldwide.
Well, next door to Tigers Bay, you got the Catholic New Lodge community. As a kid, is that a place you would have even thought of walking through?
No, it's changed now. You know. The quickest way to Belfast city centre from Tigers Bay is through the New Lodge, but if you were going in, you would have took the long way around. That's just simple. That's the way it was, and that was just normal. Nowadays it's different. You know, you can walk right through the New Lodge in the city centre, but when I was a kid, no, you wouldn't have done that. And obviously there was a lot of trouble. I seen a lot of trouble in the streets. There was, especially in the summer months, marching season, there was fights breaking out, you know, all the time pretty much. And you know, I'm 50 yards away from where riots used to break out, and I was always trying to, you know, my mum and dad would always try to get me into the house as soon as something kicked off, straight into the house. But I was at that age where I was trying to hide from them and watch it, you know, and because it was exciting. Obviously very dangerous too, but when you're a kid, it was exciting and you wanted to see it. The interface where I live in between Tigers Bay and the New Lodge, it was pretty hostile, and I grew up at the back end of the Troubles. I can only imagine what it was like at the height of it.
Well, that was Carl Frampton speaking to BBC Sport's Ben Durs, and you can read his excellent article about spending time with Frampton and Barry McGuigan in Belfast on the BBC Sport website right now. It's so fascinating, isn't it, Steve? Just to hear him talk, thinking about what life was like when Barry McGuigan was fighting, just remembering that.
Well, I came along just slightly after McGuigan's heyday. I saw McGuigan fight, but I saw him fight here at Loftus Road when he won the world title. I came along slightly after that, and the first trip I ever made to Belfast was in '88. And it was bizarre in the sense that the coach, there was no city airport. You went to the main airport, which is an awful long way away, and you had a military escort in, and there were barricades outside most of the hotels. I was told to go and wait outside the Europa, which is infamously the most bombed hotel in the world. And you went through barricades, checkpoints to get into the hotel. Barney Eastwood, McGuigan's promoter, came and collected me and then took me to his gym, then took me back there. That was it. So my first, and I'm not that old, Ellie, but my first ever visit to Belfast was basically under armed guard and being collected by people, taken to a gym and taken back. And I've been back maybe 100 times since. I've been talking about it for the last 10 years as the greatest boxing city in the world. Forget Las Vegas. There's only about one fighter that can't walk down the street in Las Vegas. In Belfast, 13 and 14-year-old kids are stopped on the street. People point them out to you and say he's the Ulster champion, he's the Irish champion. He went to the World Championships in Bucharest last year. The kid's 16 years of age. As for someone like Frampton, and Mike will tell you this, it's not that they want a selfie with him and put their drunken arms round his shoulder. They literally just want to touch his garment. They just want to be in his company. They just want to be next to him. Just like it is with McGuigan. When McGuigan's there, he walks slowly and people just want to touch him. It's literally just want to touch his arm, just tenderly touch his arm. It's bizarre.
Yeah, I mean, Mike, you're in Belfast this evening. I mean, you've clearly had a sense of that over the times you've been to see Carl Frampton fight. How much has he been shaped, do you think, by this background and the way he grew up?
Well, I think it's an interesting question because is he the man he is because of his background or despite his background? It was fascinating listening to him there speaking about his friend Glenn Branner, who was actually 16 when he died. Many would have been driven to revenge, but Frampton chose a different path. He said there, I don't want to see anything like that again, and he didn't want to get involved in any sectarian issues. But what he has been shaped by, and Steve's alluded to it there, is boxing's place in life and culture here. The amateur scene, as Steve said, is thriving. At the press conference today, there was a lot of attention not only around Frampton, but also around one of Northern Ireland's Commonwealth Games gold medalist, Paddy Barnes, who was there with his young baby, one of Ireland's most decorated amateurs. They really do know a good one here when they see one, and he's grown an audience within boxing and a great deal of respect. But also that, as Steve said right at the start, is now spreading. I mean, behind this, you've got the government, you've got the City Council, you've got the Irish Tourist Board, you've got blue chip sponsors. There really is a huge amount of backing for this tourist attraction that is Carl Frampton in Belfast.
And how does he compare as a boxer to Barry McGuigan, Steve?
Well, not at all. I mean, McGuigan's tried to distance himself completely, and Carl said, you're joking, look at him. He can only go one way, I can go 4 ways, I can go 5 ways. He can only throw 2 punches. I mean, the banter between them is quite ridiculous. Yeah, he's a very different type of fighter. Perhaps he's not as good as putting the pressure on. Perhaps we'll find out he won't be as good at finishing fights as Barry McGuigan was. But I think he moves better than Barry McGuigan. Does he punch as hard? He possibly does punch as hard. Has he proved himself yet? No, he's not. The comparisons, and McGuigan will hold his hands up. McGuigan will tell you, it's not hype. Hasn't got to hype him. The place is as good as sold out. He thinks that the push behind Frampton is bigger than the push ever was behind him. And behind him, it was absolutely ridiculous. So
but
Gordon knows how big it is there.
I mean, Barry McGuigan transcended Northern Ireland, didn't he? And I think there are some characters in sport, in particular political situations, who transcend their sport. I mean, would you put Barry McGuigan and potentially Carl Frampton, Mike, in that category?
Yeah, I think Frampton's got work to do. You see, when we talk about big fights these days, whether it's Froch against Groves or potentially Brook against Khan, any of these big fights, what they don't have, if we're to try to build another golden era in boxing, is the backing of terrestrial television and the constant backing of daily newspapers, although the local Belfast newspapers here are fully behind Carl Frampton. But I do think that when you look back to those days of McGuigan and 18 million people on BBC One watching him win the world title at Loftus Road in 1985, this is a different kind of marketing process, and that's why it's a much harder job to make Carl Frampton to transcend not only sport but cultural life in general, not only here in Northern Ireland but across the UK and the home nations as we know them.
And which is, of course, is exactly what McGuigan has said. It was different in my day. When I fought here at the King's Hall, the Ulster Hall, in title defences, the press came here for a week from England. They came over from Britain for a week and plastered it. In all fairness now, Mike, we are all catching up with this Frampton phenomenon. I've been going over a lot in the last 5 or 6 years for the simple reason people have paid me to go. Let's not forget that. I've gone over for various Irish channels and various Irish radio to do my work, and it's been a pleasure being there. But the whole thing with McGuigan, and Mike just said it there, 18 million people. When you've got audiences like that on terrestrial TV, it's hard for the rest, to be honest with you, Ellie.
Yeah, it's such a different era now. Let's talk a little bit about the venue itself, Mike, because Barry and his promotional company have taken the very unusual step of actually building a stadium specifically for this.
Yeah, and it's a hugely ambitious project financially. The BBC Proms in the Park were held in a similar arena in a similar place right by the waterside at the River Lagan last year, and they're happening again on Saturday week. And Barry was telling me today at the press conference that their thinking behind the decision to settle for this historic setting was quite straightforward.
It wasn't economical to go indoors, no arena big enough to make it work financially, and Windsor Park, the national football, was not available, it was under construction. Casement Park, the GAA pitch, was under construction. There were a number of football clubs that we looked closely at, but we just felt from the potential of sectarianism and it still is there, that there might be a problem, but we didn't have anything. And then I had a conversation with the First Minister, Peter Robinson, and he said, why don't you go down to the Titanic? So the venue is extraordinary. It's right parallel with the slipways where the Titanic was launched over 100 years ago. It is an amazing, amazing, amazing venue. Right underneath the two cranes, Samson and Goliath, we've got this 60, 70 million pound building right in front of us that shaped like the Titanic. Look to the right, we've got Cave Hill and Belfast Castle. More importantly, it's 800 yards as the crow flies from where Carl grew up in Tigers Bay. So it couldn't be more Belfast. It couldn't represent Belfast in a more amazing way. 16,000 people, Mike. Biggest audience that's ever been at a boxing match in the history of boxing in Northern Ireland. And we know that Carl will have to be at his very best to beat Kiko Martinez.
And Mike, Barry McGuigan's company have put money into this stadium, into making it happen, but other people have as well, haven't they?
Yes, all the way down from the Irish government, the City Council, the Irish Tourist Board, and many big sponsors as well, because they see this as a good news story for Belfast and for Northern Ireland and the UK in general. And Carl Frampton is everything they want, and Barry just articulated it there to express what is good about what's going on in Belfast right now.
And there is an awful lot going on in Belfast right now, Mike. You know, over the last 4 or 5 years, being out of different fights, you know, you've watched it after the fight. You've watched you can walk out of an arena, and I've walked with 1,100 people. I've walked with 1,700 people. I've walked with 3,000 people. And the last 2 fights, I've walked with 9,000 people. And on Saturday, I'm going to walk with 16,000 people. And they flood back. It's almost religious into the city centre, which might, by the way, be half a mile away. It's quite, you know, you might have to walk half a mile before you find 300 bars and restaurants. Go figure. No wonder it's a great city.
Mike, how big a financial gamble is this, though?
Well, I think it is, and it's one that all promoters and managers make when they get to this level of a fighter's career, and it comes down to how much faith they have in their particular prospect, in this case McGuigan and Carl Frampton. He's been saying for a long time, as Barry McGuigan, that this is a very special character, and he's put a lot of faith and a lot of backing in terms of his mentoring and his management of Carl Frampton. He's been around for an awful lot of his sparring. He's been around for a lot of his training, even though it's masterminded in general by Barry's son, Shane McGuigan. Barry McGuigan has been very hands-on with the development of Carl Frampton, and I think he's a lot older than 18 fights unbeaten in terms of his professional career because of the backing he's had all the way through from Barry McGuigan.
Now, Mike is in Belfast ahead of commentary on Carl Frampton's world title fight against Kiko Martinez on Saturday night, which you'll be able to hear live on 5 Live. Frampton says he won't be fazed by fighting in front of 16,000 fans and in his hometown.
No, well, that's the thing. I'm very cool. I like to stay cool and calm. And if you see me in the change rooms beforehand, I'm relaxed, I'm sitting down, I'm chilled out, I'm having a laugh. But when it's time to get ready and in the zone, I'm in the zone and I'm thinking about one thing. The crowd's great. You know, I feed off the crowd, but I remain cool and calm and collected in the ring. Don't let them get to me. It's very important for that not to happen. And I haven't done it so far, so it's not going to happen on Saturday night.
And how many times have you run over in your head that moment when the belt's strapped around your waist?
So many. It's going to be the first fight that my daughter's going to be at, and I've talked to her about it. I've talked to her that I'm going to get her in the ring after the fight and lift her up, and people are going to be cheering for her, and she's excited too. It's going to be something to treasure forever, and I'll remember to soak it all up. You know, I'll take a look, I'll relax after I have the belt on, and I'll just look around and remember this for the rest of my life.
There's a great reason why I think Carla's his name of his daughter's going, even though she prepares Peppa Pig to her dad. Whenever he's on, he leaves the room for get a cup of tea. She comes in, she turns over to Peppa Pig. But there's a great reason why she's having to go, and you probably know this, Mike. It's quite simple. They can't find a sitter. Because
in the whole of Belfast,
they cannot find a sitter they trust their 3-year-old daughter with in the entire country, north and south of the border.
No one prepared to read bedtime stories at 10 o'clock. No way.
There is, and here's another challenge, Ellie. I'd love our brothers and sisters in Belfast to do this. If 20 cameras were set up at 20 different random streets in Belfast between about 10ish and about 10:30. It will be empty. It'll be like 5 o'clock in the morning in the Outer Hebrides. I absolutely guarantee guaranteed. So that's the reason why the daughter is going. It's quite simple. They can't find a sitter.
And it was a lovely scene there today at the press conference, Steve, when you see all these brooding men at the top table, and Kiko Martinez was looking very sullen and almost nervous, I have to say, very withdrawn behind dark glasses. And then there was this little 3-year-old running all the way around the big room. And then at the end of it, as I walked towards Carl Frampton and just introduced myself again and said, can we record something for BBC 5 Live? He said, yeah, go ahead. And suddenly this little creature appeared down by my knee, and she was pointing to her lips, asking Daddy for a kiss. So it was a couple of minutes before we could actually get going with the interview. But
how refreshing is that when you think of the scenes that we see sometimes at press conferences, at weigh-ins?
Well, how about this, Ellie? You know what he listens to in the changing room before the fight? He listens to, he sits in that changing room, okay? He gets there, he listens to Sam Cooke, classic 60s soul songs. That's what he listened to. His friend Paddy Barnes, by the way, who's completely erratic. He's a lovely guy, Paddy, but completely off the wall. Remember him up in the Commonwealth Games up in Glasgow. It's just a mad interview. He can't he can't be in the changing room. He has to go in and try and turn it off. But that's what Carl does. And I don't know, Mike, I don't know how he does stay calm, because McGuigan, and I'm going to say this now, Barry loses his mind the day before and the night of a fight. And when McGuigan gets in the ring on Saturday night, he will be sweating and he'll be throwing more punches than Carl. I can guarantee you that. And yet Carl, he's just like those mad Kenyan marathon runners that you work with, Mike. They don't have a heartbeat, I swear to you.
And he's just in this bubble. And I know we're not fighters at that level, Steve, but I was watching Martinez today and looking across at Frampton, not only behind the dais when the press conference was underway, but beforehand and afterwards, and how he was just strolling up and down the various cameras and microphones with his hands in his pockets, as if he was just out on a day at the attraction that is Titanic Belfast, like all those other ticket-paying spectators there were today. And I would have found that really, I suppose, in one sense, I would have found that off-putting as far as Saturday night's concerned, almost intimidating. Yeah. Just wondering why this man is so calm. Remember, he's the challenger. Yeah. I know he's beaten Martinez before, but Martinez has got a great string of victories since then, including, most recently, a win in Japan. We've been talking about Kell Brook and how rare it is for a British or European fighter to go to the States and win a title over there. It's even more rare for a European to go to Japan and win, which he did last time, having created a massive shock to win the title in the first place. So how and why Carl Frampton is so calm, only he knows. And it's absolutely genuine, because as I walk towards him today, there's a freshness in the face. There's no sign of any problem making the weight today, unlike Martinez, who looked a bit withdrawn to me. But absolutely just so intriguing to try to measure the character that is Frampton at this first juncture, Steve, at this level. We've seen him, down the years building up to this, but at world title level, for him still to be in such control is remarkable.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? You talk about Carl Frampton looking very calm, very relaxed, like a dad out during the summer holidays with his little girl. Yeah. But Martinez himself, let's talk a bit about him. He's looked pretty calm and collected in the build-up to this fight. And Barry McGuigan says that's something that Carl Frampton needs to be wary of.
I remember the one guy that gave me the hardest fight I ever had was Juan Laporte, and he was lovely. And I remember we never met each other, and we was using my gym but using it earlier in the day. And one day I happened to be early and he happened to be late, and he was coming down the stairs and I saw him and he went, "Hey Barry, nice to see you, man." And I went, no. Normally what would happen, the guy would go, "I'm going to do this, I'm going to beat you up," and all that sort of stuff. But this was a real gentleman. And I knew when I shook his hand and looked into his eyes, by God, I was going to have a fight. And I'm looking into Kiko's eyes, and I know Carl is going to have a tremendously searching fight.
Because what they actually believe, Kiko Martinez, they announced this fight in London on something like the 1st of July, and I went down and spoke to Kiko Martinez through a brilliant translator. There was a Spanish lawyer who had a London accent. It was really bizarre. And he translated, and you could see Kiko shrugging his shoulders. Kiko can't believe, even though he got stopped when he went to Belfast in February of last year, he cannot believe the McGuigans and Frampton have agreed to this fight. He cannot believe. He said through the translator, I told them for the last fight I wasn't ready. I told them I had problems outside the ring. I told them I would give him a rematch the next week. They have not wanted to speak to me. I cannot believe they've taken this fight. And then, as Mike alluded to, the run of victories he's had, if a British fighter had had this run of victories, he took a fight against an unbeaten American to win the world title. He went to Japan, and let's not mince our words, he went to Japan to lose to a former double world champion, ended up dropping the guy twice and stopping him in 7 rounds. He's on a brilliant run of form, and he just now, even now, still thinks that McGuigan and Frampton have made a big mistake.
And the closest we got, Steve, to hostility today was when Kiko Martinez reminded Carl Frampton that after that first fight, which ended with a knockout, beautiful sharp right hand from Carl Frampton in the 9th round, but Frampton left the ring with a perforated eardrum and was out of the ring for 8 months. And Martinez says he was out of the ring for 8 months because he was recovering from the injuries that he'd sustained from the onslaught of Martinez in the 8 completed rounds. But Frampton replied by saying a perforated eardrum is the kind of thing you can get with a slap from your ma. And actually his mum was in the front row, so there was great laughter all around. But there is incredulity in the Spaniards' camp at the confidence that's being shown by Frampton. But in terms of that lack of hostility, and you were talking earlier about how lovely it was for a young child to be walking up to dad and asking for a kiss in these normally very hostile situations. But I think what's at stake here is really huge. It's about Carl Frampton, the entity, not just the boxer here. You've got so many interests behind him from the government downwards, and there's such a push for this to remain a good news story in Belfast that they don't want that being unhinged by any unnecessary controversy, either here at the press conference or tomorrow at the weigh-in. Now, the first time they fought, there was some histrionics at the weigh-in when Martinez did the slit throat gesture, which we often see at weigh-ins, and there was a lot of pointing and shoving and pushing, and the two men need to be separated. But I think it's unlikely we'll see a repeat of that tomorrow because of all that's being pushed behind Frampton here to make this a good story for Saturday night. But they're looking further ahead for this to be a story of the future as well.
Well, you can hear that fight on Saturday night on 5 Live. First bell, I think, around about 10:30 in the evening, and Mike will be ringside for that one. On 5 Live then, this Saturday night, from around about 10:30, we've got commentary on Carl Frampton's first world title fight against Kiko Martinez, the IBF Super Bantamweight champion. So, before we go, guys, we need a prediction from both of you. How's it going to go, Mike?
Well, Barry McGuigan said today that Kiko Martinez might well have improved since the first fight against Carl Frampton, which ended with a knockout for Frampton in the 9th round. But he said he hasn't developed into Sugar Ray Robinson overnight. And it's true that Kiko Martinez can box only one way. He's a marauding, aggressive, come-forward type, and that's what we're going to see on Saturday night. But Frampton did concede to me today that even within that very easy-to-deal-with style in some cases for a clinical puncher like Frampton, that he has improved even within his own remit. And so I fancy it will be more difficult on Saturday night. I do think Frampton will win, but I think he'll have to go all the way to do it.
I think it will come right down to the wire. I can see him being bashed up again. He was very marked after the last fight, even though he was ahead on 2 or 3 points on all scorecards. I think Frampton wins on points, but I wouldn't be at all surprised, Mike, if Kiko Martinez and his people leave the ring screaming blue murder. What a night it will be.
Steve Bunce, Mike Costello, thank you very much indeed, as always.